Good evening, everyone, and welcome to OTF Connects, November the 16th. We're really happy to welcome all of you here tonight, and we're really happy to have Maria Van Vallis back again. Maria has been presenting for OTF Connects for a while now. I think, Maria, you know Syria, don't you?
I do know Syria.
Yeah, she always speaks very highly of you, and I think it was Syria that introduced us in the first place. Anyway, Maria comes to us with a great deal of teaching experience, and she's now working at the Critical Thinking Consortium, and she'll tell us all about that. And I've attended a few of Maria's sessions, and they're always very thought-provoking and very interesting. So a very warm welcome to all of you, and absolutely to Maria. And I'm going to turn my mic off now and let you get going.
Thanks so much, Susan, and welcome to all of you. It's great to be with you on this, it's now dark and cold evening, but it's kind of nice to cozy up, I think, with a webinar. So as Susan mentioned, I have been teaching for over 16 years, and I've got teachables in a number of different areas, including mathematics, English, and the social sciences, social studies. And I've also worked across grade levels as well. But I'm currently pursuing doctoral work in curriculum teaching and learning at the University of Toronto, and also supporting the work of the Critical Thinking Consortium. And I wanted to ask if you can just show in the poll any of you who have done work or done an OTF session with the Critical Thinking Consortium, if you just want to put that in the box.
Okay, so it doesn't seem like too many have, oh, we've got Karen. She's done some work with the consortium before. So just to give people a little bit of background, the Critical Thinking Consortium is an educational not-for-profit, and it was founded about 20 years ago, and the mandate of the organization, it's been stakeholders within education, teachers and administrators, curriculum developers, professors. So as curriculum was being revised and developed, this whole concept of critical thinking being a very important skill was really coming to the forefront. But a number of teachers said, you know, how do we actually explicitly teach critical thinking? And our work has evolved, so we're really talking now a lot about quality thinking and trying to really nurture and bump up our students' ability to think. Karen, great. I'm glad. I thought your name was a little familiar, and I'm glad that you've done a session before. So there might be some things that are a little bit of review for people, but I hope that for you that the learning just continues to spiral, which I find for myself, you know, as you explore the concepts from a new way, you know, you're able to do that. So I'm not sure how all of you are feeling at this point in the year. You know, we still have quite a bit of a ways to go until the holidays, but I've always liked these little owls, and I feel like I can resonate with them, and I'm wondering if you can relate at all to these little owls on the screen. Carolyn says, oh yes. So I make a little joke about these owls, like someone has likened being a teacher to being at a children's birthday party with no balloons, no clown, and no cake. You're it. And I think what it is that we're trying to do is engage students. And so I want to talk tonight as well to look at this idea of conceptual thinking from the perspective of engaging students in the learning, and how we might shift the cognitive work that we do, so that if what's true is that the one who's doing the thinking, the one who's doing that work, that cognitive work, is the one doing the learning, how do we become really intentional and better at setting up our tasks so that we're supporting students and providing these opportunities for them to do more of the thinking? And that's what I'm hoping, you know, tonight we're going to explore together, and you'll get some ideas about that. I know that you already do that in your classroom. So this is just a chance for us to revisit and revise and consider those things. And I know what's nice about having a small group is that I would love to get people chatting, you know, just using the mic, and we can go in turns. And I know there's a wealth of experience here, so I would really like to get your voices here and present during the session. So I have framed a little overarching inquiry for us. So as we're going through this, you know, this next hour and a half, to be thinking about how we can be more intentional and more effective in nurturing deep conceptual understandings in students. So, and we're gonna explore this idea of thinking conceptually and thinking in concepts. And I'm gonna ask you to set up a little, this is just a little example of a little thought book, and it could be right now on your computer that you just sort of open up a little notepad or a little document in Word that you can go to, or it could be on a piece of paper. But I'm going to be giving you a little critical challenge, and I'm going to invite you at the end if you want to take a picture of it and send it to me. I'll put my email up at the end, or you just want to you know, save it and email it to me. But I am going to ask you to think about something as we're going through tonight. And that is, I want you to do a little 3-2-1 where you will select 3 things you learned today about nurturing quality thinking. Yeah, or tweet it out, thanks Susan, that had an impact on you. Select 2 practical ideas you're planning to try in your classroom next week, and 1 powerful question or piece of feedback for me. So this is what I'm going to be asking you to do. So for the next hour and a half, be thinking about this critical challenge. We're going to revisit this slide a couple of times, and you'll be able to, you know, consider this, and then hopefully you'll have sometimes more than 3 ideas, more than 2 ideas, and you're going to select the ones that are, you know, the most usable for you, or the things that had the most impact for you. Is that, and just to get a thumbs up, is that clear for everybody about our critical challenge? Awesome. Okay. So I'm just, before we continue, I thought, again, because we're such a small group, if maybe we could start at the top with Asa. If you could tell us who you are, what you're teaching, and what drew you to the session. So what it is that you're hoping to get from tonight. So just use your mic at the very top, and we'll just go down. So Asa, and then Carolyn, Christine, Isabel. Oh, and Isabel, I'm sorry you're still having issues. So Asa, did you want to start? Okay. Now, if you see the, there's a little, where the screen is, audio and video, there's a little talk button right underneath that. So maybe I'll go to Carolyn, and then we can come back to you, Asa, if that's okay.
Okay, so I am really technologically impaired, so I'm hoping I'm doing this right. Sorry, the question was, Caroline, I am from Ottawa. I I'm teaching grade 1 math, and I'm not quite sure what I'm hoping to get out of it.
That's okay. You're just here to do some learning.
I'm here for the learning. Yeah, I've been to 3 others, and I just listened and learned.
Fantastic. Well, welcome. Christine. Okay, Christine is writing too, so there might be some mic issues. Let's go to Isabel, then we can come back to Christine or see what she says in the chat box.
I'm not sure if it's working because my screen's going crazy.
Yes, it is working. It is working. We can hear you.
Perfect. Okay, so I can talk, but my screen is being weird, so I might not be able to read the chat. But I'm actually currently in my teaching certificate program at the University of Toronto in the Masters of Arts in Child Studies and Education. So I'm graduating this year, and I'm going to have my certificate this year. I'm specifically interested in teaching FSL. I am from Ottawa, and I'm a native Francophone speaker. So I'm taking the session kind of just to add to my knowledge as a teacher candidate and add to my resume as well.
That's great. Thank you very much. Karen. Okay, great. So Karen's learning about the conceptual thinking in the primary grades. And Melanie. Okay, great. So Melanie is teaching grade 5 and is interested in this idea of conceptual thinking. Christine, grade 3, fresh ideas regarding using inquiry. Great. Thank you so much. I'm hoping that I will be able to meet all of your needs. Because this is designed for K to 8, so I have different examples. So even when I'm using examples of material that might be curricular from a different age group, I think some of the structure will hopefully be useful as you start to think about it in your own context. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to look at these 2 questions and think about what are the most important differences between the 2 questions. And feel free to write right on the slide itself, or if you're more comfortable, to write in the chat box, either way. Or if you feel like hopping on the mic, that's no problem too. Again, we have a small group, so we can do that as well.
It's Susan here. I'm just going to mention while people are thinking and writing that if you're wanting to use your microphone and you're not set up yet, there's 2 ways of checking your audio, and you can do that right now during the session. It won't interrupt anything. Right above the talk button beside audio video, there's a little microphone with a red gear symbol on it, and that's the audio setup wizard. So you can use that to check your audio settings. You can also go under the tools menu and choose audio, and it will get that set up for you. I know some of you may not have a built-in microphone. I know I'm on a monitor that doesn't have one, so I have to use a headset. So you may have limitations, but it would be great, as Maria said, with a group this size to hear your voices.
Okay, so Melanie said that with question 2, you have to justify your thinking. Definitely, that's true. It's definitely a characteristic of the second question that we have here. Any other thoughts about the most important differences between these 2 questions?
Hi, it's Asa. I think the first one would be a lot more difficult to answer. You have to kind of work out an answer, while the other one is easier to look up, number 2.
Okay, so question 1, maybe you have to actually think about it in terms of the math. So the question I have for you is a whale a fish?
No, mammal.
So again, thinking about this idea of how we're classifying, you know, how we're thinking about it. It's a mammal, but is it still? It's a mammal, but is it a fish? Is it a mammal fish?
It looks like one.
Yeah. So students, Isabel thinks students may have more background knowledge to refer to in the second question. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting when we're looking at these 2 questions. We may need to use some of the math to figure out the weight of the whale and to be able to enter into the question that way. But question 1 does have an answer in terms of when we figure it out and we have an understanding of the scientific principles and the weight. With question 2, what we're looking at there is a question of concept. It's the concept of what a fish is. And you were talking about the concept of what a mammal is. It's like we have to decide, does a whale, does it belong to that concept, right? And this comes from the work, I said there, of John Wilson in his book, Thinking in Concepts. So one is really a question of fact, and the other is a question of concept. We're thinking about whether the whale does belong to this concept of fish. So we're going to explore this a little bit. So concepts are really the driving force behind true inquiry and the pedagogy of inquiry. They're a higher level of abstraction than facts when we look at the structure of knowledge. There's so much work and research you could do just on this idea of concepts. And there's varying degrees of abstraction, and we're going to look at different examples of this. They help to bring focus and depth to study, and it's what really leads students to that transferable conceptual understanding. So when a student, for example, has a conceptual understanding of measurement or justice or ecosystems, right? They bring a focus and depth, and they help students be able to relate facts but connect them to this larger abstraction. And they really do, it's concepts that actually really engage us in learning. They build dimensions of our brain, and the research continues to show this, that our intellectual growth really comes through the development of conceptual understandings. And Hilda Taba, who did some wonderful, exciting work in the 60s around thinking, stated that a person's understanding of a concept grows as they experience increasingly complex conceptual examples. So when we think about this reality about concepts, that they really are the driving force behind inquiry, that they're a higher level of abstraction than facts in the structure of knowledge, that they bring focus and depth to study, that they engage students, what are the implications of that for our practice as educators? So I'm going to ask that, and again, if you want to answer that in the chat box, you want to jump on the mic. As we start to think about this idea of a concept, it's something that is more universal and timeless in nature than a fact. So what are your thoughts in terms of any implications for us as educators if these are all true, right? So the big, Carolyn's saying the big ideas versus the nitty gritty. I'm just going to wait to see, because I see some other people are writing, so I'm just waiting for them to finish. I'll move forward, and then you can get your ideas into the chat box. So I'm going to ask you to look at these two columns, and I've got yes examples of concepts and no examples, and then I have a tester, and I'd like you to decide whether you think the tester belongs in the yes example or the no example. And again, feel free, this is a safe environment, we'll just, we'll talk it out. And if you want to say a little bit about why, if you're saying no, a little bit about why, if you're saying yes, a little bit about why, so that just so we can pull out some of the characteristics of concepts that are developing here. And again, you can jump on your mic if you just want to share your thinking. It might be easier than typing. Okay, so it's a term that leaves room for interpretation. Any other thoughts? Anyone else want to jump on the mic or write about this? It's very general, Asa says, and can be looked at many different ways. Right? And then we see in our no examples that these are they're very specific. The no examples in certain, not all of them, but some of them could be characterized as a topic of study versus a concept. Or some of them could be considered a specific example of a concept. Susan says it's a big idea that encompasses many things. And I just want to ask you to look again at the structure of what I've asked you to do here. So this, if you're not familiar with it, a number of you may be, but just in case you're not, this yes example, no example is a concept attainment strategy. And Jerome Bruner in 1956 wrote a book, A Study of Thinking, and he really was digging into how people think. And it had a lot of implications because we're looking at how people think. That helps us in terms of how people learn. And so the idea of concept attainment is you find the rule. It's a backwards conceptualizing approach to making sense of new ideas. So it's a teaching strategy that's characterized by a pattern of decisions, right, that you have to make. So in this, you can think about any concept that you want to nurture in students, that you can use this concept attainment strategy. And it takes a bit of time, like for you to, as you do it more and more and more, you start to see its power in terms of students actually, they have to think about it versus I could maybe give you the definition of concept and have you write it down. But in this way, I'm asking you to have to grapple, right? There's not an easy answer. I'm having you to grapple, looking at these yes examples, no examples, having to pull out those characteristics yourself. And in doing that, it leads to a deeper understanding. It leads to having to really get a sense of, okay, what is a concept? So that you're doing more of the thinking as opposed to me providing you with the definition and you writing it down. So if you haven't used concept attainment strategies, I encourage you to look them up, to read more about them. There's wonderful work in the Beyond Monet book for anyone who is not familiar with that, the book that came out from Barry Bennett and Carol Rollheiser that looks at a number of different instructional strategies and tactics, and they have a chapter on concept attainment. So again, this is an example of something you can do easily with big ideas that you want to help support in students. And I'll show you some different examples a little bit later. So what criteria has to be met for us to categorize something as a concept? Well, it needs to be broad and abstract. So, and there's macro levels and micro levels, but it has to transfer across context. So for example, if we're looking at writing, if we're looking at concepts in writing, organization is a macro concept, and then details are a micro concept. Voice, in terms of writing, the writing voice is a macro concept, and then tone is a micro concept. So that has to be true, that a concept is broad and abstract, but then there's different levels of generalization, and then it's represented by one or two words. So that's just helping us continue to build our understanding of concepts. And when we're looking at curriculum, and we're looking at unit design and lesson design, concepts are what we also refer to as big ideas, what we refer to sometimes as enduring understandings, or essential understandings. So we're trying to think about how we teach to those concepts and why doing that can be so transformative in teaching and learning. So I'm going to ask you to look at this definition from H. Lynn Erickson, who's done a lot of work on teaching through concepts. And I want you to decide for you which statement best supports your understanding of concept from this paragraph. So which one sentence, which one statement best supports your understanding of concept? And again, if you feel comfortable jumping on the mic, just to share some of your thinking, please feel free. There's no right or wrong answers. Just welcome your thinking about this. So is there a statement here that for you best supports your understanding of concept? Okay, thank you, Isabel. And again, did you want to just share a little bit, if you want to just pop on the mic and tell us why for you that particular statement really helps your understanding?
Okay, I'm on mobile now, so I don't know if it works. Is it okay?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So for me, the whole thing about having it be cross-disciplinary is really important because a concept is something that's general and that kind of is the big idea. I think it's important to look at it in regards to the different disciplines. So if we're looking at one concept, we can look at it in an arts kind of view, at a scientific kind of point of view. So looking at it from those different disciplines is really important.
Great. Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. Caroline, I think, concepts are a higher level of abstraction than facts. And do you want to just, again, I'm not sure if your mic works, if you feel comfortable just, you know, sharing a little bit of your thinking about why that statement in particular resonated for you.
I'm not sure if it's working or not.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking of what I see in grade 1 math. I've got lots of little kids that, you know some math facts. They go to, say, Kumon or something like that, and they've got their math facts down, and you can tell what they've studied because they're really good with those. But as soon as you get more into the concept of what the numbers really mean, the number sense, then there's a difference in, you know, the fact that they have memorized these facts versus actually the understanding of the numbers.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Absolutely. Because, and that's that important point, is that when we understand something conceptually, we're able to do much more transfer across disciplines, across situations with that knowledge, because it's not something that we've just committed to memory and can draw up, but we have that deeper understanding of what, for example, you know, numbers are, right? Or addition, right? We have a conceptual understanding of addition that allows us to work with that in different contexts. Thank you for that. And again, if people want to share more, please feel free in the chat box. So a key question, you know, as we're doing our unit designs as teachers, it's to really take that moment to stop, to not just think of in terms of topic or activities, but to take that step back and ask, how do I support my students in developing deeper conceptual understandings through this unit of study? Whatever the discipline is, whether it's physical education, whether it's drama, dance, art, mathematics, English, social studies, science, how can we help them develop that deeper conceptual understanding and to make that our intention? So the work of Paulo Freire, as a, looking at critical pedagogy, I'll give you a moment just to read this passage from Freire. So Freire here is actually helping conceptualize a dimension of education whereby when students aren't making those kinds of deep and rich connections and thinking conceptually, they're just absorbing facts, without truly comprehending what they're learning. So Caroline was alluding to this. So how do we emphasize that deeper understanding? How do we not just have students be compliant and be receptors or collectors, but support them in this development of big ideas? And inquiry, actually inquiring into and constructing knowledge, not just memorizing knowledge. So that really brings us to the concept of a thinking classroom. And that's a classroom where students are learning to think and they're thinking to learn. So thinking is not an end of unit task. It's not something we do after we absorb a whole series of facts, but the thinking is actually the methodology that we're using. It's the way to engage and deepen students' understanding of the subject matter and curriculum. That's really what we're talking about, is this concept of a thinking classroom. And I want to bring in this idea of critical thinking here. At the consortium, this is a pedagogically useful definition that we've developed, that when you're thinking critically, you're thinking through a problematic situation about what to believe or how to act, where the thinker makes a reasoned judgment that reflects the competent use of the intellectual tools for quality thinking. So even going back to the concept attainment strategy I gave you, that was a problematic situation where you had to decide. You had to make a reasoned judgment. And as you were doing that, you were actually bringing to bear some key intellectual tools. So you're bringing in your background knowledge, about just even the words that were there. You're bringing some background knowledge about concepts themselves as an educator. You were trying to make a decision about teamwork and which category, what was a sound, what was the most sound conjecture for you about where teamwork belonged. And you were using different habits of mind, like you had to persevere, you had to pay attention to the details of looking at all of those ideas. So you were using a number of intellectual tools as you were working through that problematic situation. So, when we're thinking about critical and conceptual thinking, I also want us to consider how connected they are and whether it's even possible to develop deep conceptual understandings without making reasoned judgments. Is it even possible for us to really understand some of these abstract concepts without having to think critically? And when we're looking at this concept of a thinking classroom, so thinking about your own classrooms, thinking in the first quadrant, how are you shaping the climate to support thinking, right? Are students expected to make up their own minds? Are there expectations and routines, of think, pair, share, for example, of students having to construct knowledge, of students being able to grapple with a question or a problem? Are opportunities being created for thinking where students are presented with problematic situations, where we take the curriculum and we do problematize it for students as opposed to delivering it or covering it? Are we building their capacity to think by paying attention to those intellectual tools? And are we giving them guidance that's actually designed to nurture their thinking? Are we giving them guidance about their habits of mind? Are we supporting them in developing thinking strategies like a pro-con chart or rating scales or various different heuristic devices that we can use to help students come up and make their reasoned judgments? Do we use the vocabulary of thinking in our classrooms? Words like conjecture, evidence, justify, all of this. And as we're learning about background knowledge, as we're building it, are we doing it with a thinking approach? So again, I just wanted to give you a minute right now to just revisit your 3-2-1, because we've been, working for the last really about 30-35 minutes. And just to take a moment to come back to 3-2-1 in terms of anything that you've learned thus far that's having an impact on you, any practical ideas that you've picked up. So just take a minute now to revisit that. Okay, so I'm going to keep going, and again, you can continue to work on this as we go along. So what's the most powerful indicator that we have to know that students are intellectually engaged in the task or challenge that they've been presented with? So when we're talking about engagement in general, we know we're engaged in something when we're really involved in it, we're absorbed, we're committed. Like I really love to cook, so I can get lost. Like I read cookbooks like they're fiction, like I have a little stack beside my bed and I'm really into it. But I also want to differentiate that kind of engagement and the different things I'm engaged with, in the course of my life. But I want to make a distinction between that form of engagement and educational engagement. Because when we're educationally engaged, that's when we as teachers and the students are personally committed to pursuing the educational goals and to successfully performing their ongoing teaching and learning tasks. So how do we know when students are educationally engaged? What does that look like? And I want to invite you to consider this taxonomy of engagement, this difference between just being on task, students who comply and sort of are always looking to us to, like, what do I need to do and tell me what I need to do. Students who are interested is always great, or entertained by what's going on in the class, that they care about what they're learning or what they're doing in their work. But I think when we're really looking at what we're aiming for, we want students to be really challenged and transformed, empowered by what they're learning. And in so many ways, it's by engaging in those critical, creative, collaborative, conceptual thinking opportunities that we move students, and students can get engaged at those higher levels on this taxonomy. And they're still doing all the things below. They still care and are interested and compliant, like compliant in the good sense of they're actually on task and doing what they need to be doing. But they're actually being transformed and challenged by what they're learning. And I think this is important because when the Canadian Education Association did their study in, I think it was, I can't remember now, 2011, of what did you do in school today, and they asked 67,248 grade 5 to 12 students about engagement, and you can notice that the engagement starts off quite high in grade 5 at 82%, and look what happens by grade 12, right? It's almost in half. So, and they're still engaged in school. They still have a sense of belonging. That remains high. Their participation in school and clubs and all of those things remains high. But this idea of being educationally or intellectually engaged really starts to decline. And so I just wanted to include this because I think it is really important to continue to reflect on how we are designing the opportunities in our classroom to really engage students. And conceptual understanding is a way to cognitively engage students, because engagement isn't something that we can cause in others, it's something people experience. So as passionate as we can be as educators and enthusiastic about the topic, that might get some students interested, but we can't cognitively through osmosis get them challenged or caught up, right? Yes, thank you, Christine. We need to make the topic relevant to their lives. And also trust that with scaffolding and support, they can think in terms of those big ideas, and those big ideas really are intellectually engaging for us as human beings, right? That we really, when we find the relevance in them and we start to think conceptually, as Hilda Tauba said, that's where we really grow. Like, that's where we intellectually develop. So when we're looking at this, we want to make sure that we're nurturing students to build the skills, but also challenging them. And you can see that that's where we hit that orange sweet spot where students get really in the flow. So again, looking at how critical, collaborative, creative, and conceptual thinking can nurture that kind of engagement. So I'm going to ask you to look at these questions. So the column not critical, and then the column where the question has been reframed to invite reasoned judgment. Right? And just notice the difference between these types of questions, and think about some of the questions you're asking in your own classroom too. And think about the little subtle but important distinction between the two. What do you notice? If anyone wants to write or jump on the mic, just to talk about some of these differences. Okay, so Isabel, I'm just going to clarify. When you say it's making the questions more approachable, so would you say that are you talking about the second one or the first one? Right. And I'm going to ask you just to share a little bit about when you say approachable, just to elaborate a little bit on that idea. I think that's really interesting what you're saying.
So when I'm reading the questions, it's kind of reflecting on how students might interpret it. In the non-critical side, why is courage important? That's a very, very vague and question that can be kind of overwhelming. While as kind of framing it and considering the three most powerful, like right there, just the three, I feel like that kind of was like, okay, so there's three of them at least. Like that kind of makes you calm down a little bit, and then you can really start targeting specific things versus the other one where it's very, very broad. And then same thing with what is causing climate change versus like what is most plausible. Again, I feel like it's just making it not as intimidating, and it might encourage students to think. I don't know how to explain it, but I just feel like it would make students think more than if it was too broad of a question.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. And I think what you're seeing there is, remember we had the little framework of the thinking classroom. We have those 5 intellectual tools, and that's part of the definition of critical thinking that we've developed at the consortium. And you see here this idea of scaffolding that Asa mentions. The second question, if you look at what's there is criteria. So in the first question, consider the 3 most powerful examples. So now, as you're making your decision, you are thinking about it, you're deciding on the basis of most powerful. Whereas the first one doesn't have criteria. So it is quite broad. It is open-ended. it's not necessarily inviting critical thinking, right? Because on what basis are they deciding? Whereas this one, it's like we're looking at different examples and now we're deciding among options. And that's a really important characteristic of a critical thinking task, is that it generates and provides options, and then you need to make a decision on the basis of some criteria, right? So in the second question, which theory of climate change is most plausible? Now we're deciding among options around the different theories, which one is most plausible. And in the third one, we're not just asking students to create a title, but now they're thinking about, oh, is this a snappy title? Is it informative? And we're giving them some specifications to guide their thinking, and hopefully, you know, what comes through that is an improvement in the quality of the thinking and the quality of the actual work that they're doing. So that's some of the distinctions and why framing, just the way we frame our questions, and it doesn't mean that every question has to be this critical thinking question, but once we start to understand what the dimensions of a critical thinking question are, then again, we can be more intentional about it. Again, looking at the difference, the significant differences between these two, I guess, different tasks that we might give students. Or not only tasks, but look-fors. Yeah, and so as Christine said this earlier, the second column assesses their application than just assessing knowledge and understanding. Absolutely. So again, looking at what are the significant differences here. Okay, now as we're thinking about the kind of assessment look-fors and what we're setting up for students, how do we in our assessments move towards students showing us genuine commitments around the learning that they've done? So that, like for example, in the first line of column A, provide a definition. Well, we could cram and we could memorize a definition. But when we're using the word in a new situation, that means we genuinely understand, right? Or rather than remembering the formula, that we can actually explain why the formula works. That's showing a genuine commitment and a genuine understanding. We're actually, there's that transformation that we're looking at in terms of the engagement taxonomy, that we haven't just memorized it and done it in this particular situation, like a test or an exam, but we have embodied it, right? And how do we, again, set up things so that students are embodying more of that knowledge? So similarly, these type 1 questions versus, and you know, we talk about 3 types of questions. Type 2 are personal preference, which I haven't shown here, but this difference between a type 1 question and a little tweak that we can make that bumps up the thinking, that supports deeper conceptual understandings. Right? With the third example, learn the properties versus figure out the properties from the supplied observations. So this is an example of a concept formation strategy. So you can imagine, let's say at the primary level, you want to help students understand emotions. You could give them a sheet with a little cutout of 20 different emotions: sad, tired, afraid, lonely, happy, aloof, surprised, interesting, calm. You know, all kinds, like 20 different emotions, and then have them group the emotions, right? And so there's some concept attainment, is they're having to group emotions and understanding the concept of these different emotions and where they might belong. And that's an example of concept formation. Same as the last example, remember the definition versus identify the attributes from the examples, sort examples into categories. So there's this, we can use both concept attainment, which I did with the yes-no examples, and then concept formation. I'm just going to read Melanie. I really like the rank order, the 5 causes, because they're thinking critically about each cause. Yeah, absolutely. It's this little tweak, like instead of having them list, they rank order. Or when you're getting students to read something to build background knowledge, a really simple tweak is say, I want you to cross out the least important fact from this paragraph. Like do the non-example, or have them cite the most important fact. So similar to the little strategy when I had you read about concepts, and I asked you which sentence most helps you, even there, rather than just reading it, I was inviting you to think more critically to develop a deeper understanding. So that's just a little tweak, right? These little ways that we can bump up the thinking for students. So again, now we're sort of moving into the next part where we're going to look at some really specific, more specific examples of being more intentional and effective in nurturing these deep conceptual understandings. So using an image, right? So in this case, this is an example from grade 7 geography, but again, as I mentioned, I'm going to show you different curricular examples, but the structure is something you can apply across grades and in different disciplines. So we're trying to get at the concept of aspects of the physical environment, right? The physical environment. And there's 4 main categories in grade 7 the students need to understand. They have to understand the concept of climate, water, landforms, and vegetation. So those are the 4 key concepts of the natural environment. So why not have them look at an image and then observe the details, and now we're going to get them to pull out through their observations. And once we start sorting and classifying those observations, we get them to think about these concepts. So again, the difference between me giving them a note on the board or an overhead with, here's water, here's climate, here's landforms, here's vegetation, versus this, right, as a strategy. And then notice that in the instruction, I've asked the students to discuss your choices and reasoning with a partner. So there's an example of just creating a climate to support thinking, of getting students to be accountable for their thinking with each other, to warm up with each other around the thinking, and then sharing it. And then we start building the concept together. So that's one example, is using images and trying to pull out the key concepts from those images. Here's one from science. So another concept attainment strategy. And again, thinking about this, you can do this from kindergarten up to grade 8. You just have to change differentiate in terms of some of the concepts that you're looking at and the degree of them. But we've got our yes examples of chemical change and no examples, our testers. And then we're going to draw out the properties of chemical change, this important big idea, through this strategy. Right? So thinking about that, where would you put the testers? Where would you put them in the yes? Which one? Would you put one of them in a yes example, one in the no? Would you put them both in the yes, both in the no? And think about the kind of rich conversations that start to come up, and that intellectual engagement, rather than just providing them with definitions for chemical change and even having them match, like how this really draws upon that conceptual thinking. Great, yes, so thank you. 1 is yes and 2 is no. Awesome. Here's another one, right? Again, looking at the structure, But even look at this for in primary students, building, nurturing conceptual thinking. You could use this very slide to nurture conceptual thinking in students. It's really powerful. So just give you a moment to sort of take it in. Right. What are the characteristics of a whammy knacker? And how is that second line not an example of a whammy knacker? Just think about primary kids engaging with this challenge, or actually, I think you could do it across the grade. Like, I think I could do this with, you know, my grade 8 classes too, and it's still really, really rich for conceptual thinking. And if at any point you have any questions about these or just want to make a comment about them, or if you see their applicability, please do. Yeah. Well, we could work through this challenge together. What are people thinking are some of the characteristics of whammy knackers? Yeah, it's really, really rich. Like, it's so deceptive because you look at it and you think, oh, okay, this is going to be easy, but it's not. It's quite complex. There's so much patterning and yeah. Exactly. Every time you think you've got it, you notice that the non-example has one of the characteristics you said was needing to be a whammy knacker, or vice versa. So this is a great example. Like, we could spend a long time grappling with this, and you could like take time with your students and grapple and pull this out, and it's really, really rich. So I am going to move on. I will be putting a PDF of key slides so that you can come back to this and revisit it. But I'm going to develop us or invite us to that habit of mind of the tolerance of ambiguity. Yeah, absolutely. You can share the slide on Twitter. Again, this is you know, you could do this both with grade 6 social studies as well as the grade 7 geography. But we're looking at this concept of climate change. Now look at how this is framed, of the factors contributing to changing climate patterns. Look at the challenge that's in yellow, where what you're being asked to do is suggest to a partner which factor might play the greatest role in changing climate patterns. And one of the ways of structuring inquiry is to let's say your unit, or let's say a couple of lessons are looking at the factors contributing to climate change. Why not just make this the very first activity? Like, as soon as they sit down, you put this up and you get them to think about it. And then you provide some little briefing sheets about each one of these factors. You do some things in the lesson that invite students to consider, build more background knowledge, and then you have them come back to this so that you're inviting that kind of iterative thinking, that idea of you don't have to know the right answer. Let's start with this, let's look at it, let me think about it. based on my current background knowledge, let me build some more background knowledge, and maybe that will shift my thinking. And then we're nurturing in students that kind of open-mindedness, you know, of considering information like, oh, these were my initial thoughts. I learned more. This is what I think now, right? So again, another powerful way of engaging students in conceptual thinking is that kind of fail-forward approach, where give them something, get them playing with it, get them mucking about, get them to do some initial speculations and predictions, learn more about it, revisit it. Additionally, sorry, the printing, I should have enlarged that printing a little bit, but this concept, there's a concept of sustainability, a really important concept that, you know, is throughout the grades, goes into secondary school, goes into beyond. And as you engage more and more sustainability, of course, like Hilda Taba says, you develop a greater complexity for it. So I built with my students this idea of a sustainable response, the concept of a sustainable response. And we unpacked that a sustainable response is that it is effective, so it significantly addresses the factors that contribute to the problem. It's realistic, it's possible given the realities and constraints, like the environmental, economic, social, and cultural, and it's fair. It ensures that no group is made to bear an unfair share of responsibility. So trying to build an understanding in students of this concept of a sustainable response. And then using this, as they look at different responses, they can actually start to rate how sustainable it is. So again, deepening their conceptual understanding of a sustainable response. Okay, so another way to do that is unpack those criteria with them, get them to consider and use it. Use that conceptual understanding in order to, you know, rate other things as well. You know, is this an example of a sustainable response? So here, when we're trying to get at some of the real controversies, or looking at history, for example, in social studies from a perspective of social justice, you know, invite them. What makes a textbook account historically valid? Well, this line that we have at the bottom was from a textbook, right? And this statement now, like, how are we going to help students understand this concept of historical validity or inclusive, right? Or even accurate, or even extending that to an idea of socially just. Or even the concept of colonization. Like, these are all concepts that can be generated, but we're getting students to grapple and do the thinking, right? To look at this statement, to read additional information, to read diverse perspectives on this particular statement, and then have to discuss, is this accurate? Is this inclusive? Does it meet that criteria? If you were going to revise it, how would you make it more accurate and inclusive? And again, noticing that prompt of sharing the statement with the partner and the rest of the class. So building that culture and community of thinking where we're considering all of these things together. So, you know, when you think about this design of getting a statement, getting some of the conceptual criteria that then is applied to that statement, right? And then students have to revise it to make it reflect the criteria itself. Again, here's just an example of ranking. So here's some responses. We've got the concept of the criteria of sustainable, but we're building in students a conceptual understanding of sustainability through the process, and they need to share their preliminary ranking with the class. So think about other things you're doing and how you can bump up the thinking by getting them to rank what you've asked them to do according to a particular criteria. So I'm not sure if anybody wants to even think about that right now in relation to their particular context and then share it with the group. So maybe a unit that you're doing next week or next month or currently, and how you might use a ranking in order to help students think through something that's in your unit. Does anyone want to share how? And just let me just check in with everyone. Are these examples helpful? Oh, great. Okay. Good. Okay. So here's a math example. So I want you to, let's deduce, after spending a little time with this, let's deduce, okay, sorry, a little overwhelmed, I'm sorry. Again, we'll put a PDF of the slides and then you can revisit, and you can also always come back and listen to it again. So looking at this, let's try to deduce what mathematical concept we're exploring here. So the idea is that which of the following do not belong with the others? And the mathematical situation is in the middle. Any thoughts, by the way, about which of the following doesn't belong? Yeah, Isabel, absolutely. The graph with the drawn flowers doesn't belong because it doesn't accurately reflect the height of Rafi's plan. And so I want you, again, just inviting you to think about what this does, how this shifts student thinking and developing an understanding of difference, right? A conceptual understanding of difference and growth. You know, this and addition and subtraction conceptually, like how those ideas and representation, like this is also about the mathematical concept of representation. These are all representations of the mathematical scenario that's there in words, right? We have words, we have numbers, we have pictures, we have a number line, we have a sort of visual with blocks that are drawn. So helping students actually understand representation conceptually at a deeper level. So that's where we can see some of this in mathematics. This is something that I did with my grade 8 students. So I taught, circles and cylinders for many years. And they'd always do something rich at the end, but it was difficult to engage them to want to really learn about circles and cylinders, and without me having to resort to, okay, well, you really need this for high school. And so I was gathering different ideas, looking at Dan Meyer and his structure around math lessons and saying, take a textbook question and get rid of some of the information. So make it more, make it more rich and inviting for the students. And I decided, because I really love this museum, it's one of my favorite museums in the world, the Guggenheim. So I put it in. The very first day, I put this question up before we've even talked about circles, before we've even talked about cylinders. And I'm trying to get them to understand some of the concepts around volume and surface area of irregular shapes. So what happened is the curriculum cascades out of this challenge, because what happened is I had students get their thought books and I invited them into this challenge, and we're going to, through the course of the unit, unpack what an elegant strategy is, what a reasonable estimate would be. But I asked them, well, what do you need, how are you going to solve this? And so the students started to, say, well, we need to know, how do you measure a circle? How do you measure a shape like that? And believe it or not, the students got really hungry for learning about circles and learning about cylinders, because I had given them a challenge. So when we think about that engagement taxonomy, the students were now caught up in this challenge and they wanted to get the learning. So suddenly learning about circles and cylinders was meaningful for them because they had this challenge that they had to work with. And it was something that was non-Googleable. It wasn't something, you can't just answer that question, this question of developing an elegant strategy. There's so many layers. So framing a really rich inquiry so that we're developing a conceptual understanding around volume and surface area and estimates, and these ideas, these rich mathematical ideas, and they're having to work through that was much more meaningful than when I traditionally sort of did my lessons. And even though we did something cool at the end, I sort of felt like they weren't living with the problem long enough. So that's another strategy as we're thinking about concept attainment, is putting that rich question, that rich inquiry question up front, giving them a meaningful challenge, and getting them to live longer with the problem. Again, here's another example. Yes, absolutely. It is a lot like the new French as a second language curriculum, much more inquiry-based. So here's another mathematics example. What's the best way to represent a 2-digit number to show its meaning? This is another concept attainment strategy for the idea, the concept of 2-digit numbers. Right, and then we've got the critical thinking. We're going to be thinking about what the best way to represent the number is. Students having to think about what's accurate there. As we look at that number line, that placement of 74 doesn't look so accurate. Or, the question around, hey, putting all those pennies in the jar, is that the best way to represent 74? So you can get into some great conversations and think again of the richness that comes out in student thinking and all of the different big mathematical ideas that are getting surfaced and the kind of schema that's being surfaced in an example like this. So synergistic thinking is what happens when we connect the factual with the conceptual. So when we design our units from a conceptual lens, from that lens of the big ideas, enduring understandings, it provides focus and depth to the teaching and learning objectives. Right? We're not getting rid of the factual, it's just that we're trying to create the synergy between the factual and the conceptual. Another example of a challenge This is with algebra, which can be difficult, right, to get students at the intermediate grades, to get engaged with algebra. But here was a rich challenge they were presented with, is they were given an algebraic scenario, and then they surfaced what were some of the mathematical concepts that they might need to employ in order to solve this problem. And then they learned more about each of those concepts, started to think about how they applied to the problem, and then this algebra challenge became quite rich, right? Because now we framed it as a critical challenge. So they're having to think conceptually and apply that conceptual thinking to the algebra question. We're not just doing the procedural, and it doesn't mean that the procedural isn't in the picture. It's just that the focus isn't solely on that procedure, but it's helping them think conceptually about the mathematics involved and the application of those mathematical concepts. They actually have to rank order them, right? They actually have to rank order these ideas and concepts as they're understanding, hey, which one of these are the most important if I'm really trying to solve this problem? So they're building connections. And that's also so critical in conceptual thinking, is how we're inviting students to build those deep, rich connections between ideas. Here's an example in primary. So again, we're trying to help them develop an understanding of the concept of season. So giving them a picture book and pulling out with them, helping them with observations and inferences, teaching them, right? Even explicitly teaching them about observations. What do you see? If you were to step into this picture, what might you feel? What might you smell? Pulling out some of the qualities and characteristics of the season, and then starting to play with that, right? Looking at different images, starting to look at the different definitions of a season in this part of the world and helping them organize, right, some of the characteristics of the season. Again, the concept of similarities, right? So in grade 2, this comes up in the social studies curriculum. So getting them to really develop a deeper understanding of similarity and which of these similarities are more important, right? And the kind of deep conversation or rich conversation you might have with the grade 2s as they're considering which similarities might be more important. Again, so this grade 4 social studies, the concept of the physical environment, helping them build an understanding of that concept. So comparing the images to those in the not. So this is, again, another example of a concept attainment strategy. What are the key differences? Let's pull out and let's define, build our understanding backwards, right? Which is what concept attainment does. We're building that understanding backwards. It is an inductive strategy. So, what are the differences? And then let's build our understanding of the physical features and the non-physical features. Right? And then notice the prompt of inviting students to share the evidence for your decision. So we're inviting that kind of thinking. We're creating expectations and routines of student thinking. Concept of human rights, right? Another concept attainment strategy, looking at the differences between the two columns. What's the difference? How do we build our understanding of the concept of human rights? And again, a routine and expectation of building a climate that supports thinking is that students have to discuss the meaning of human rights with the whole class. So we're building that together. We're nurturing that thinking conceptually together. Right? Another strategy, right, is sorting the words into the two columns. So one is facts and one is goals. So one is really the concept of values. So, the concept, we're helping build their understanding conceptually of the difference between facts and values. So this is another strategy to do that. Right? And again, thinking about how they're going to engage with this, the kinds of conversations, the kinds of knowledge, the kind of understanding that they're developing in this process. And again, a routine, you're going to discuss the reasons for your sorting with the whole class. So we're building a climate that supports thinking. We're creating that kind of an expectation. Here, the students are, we're working with the concept of an inclusive society. We're focusing on one sign of inclusive society shown here or added by your class. Picture a situation where that sign is not in evidence. So we're starting to unpack the concept of an inclusive society, right? What is involved in an inclusive society? So we're nurturing student thinking in that way. Right, so students would look at one of these, like barrier-free access. Okay, where do we have evidence of barrier-free access? Let's look in our community. Where is an example where that's not in evidence? Right, so we're starting to develop our understanding of this. Again, just showing you a visual of the concept attainment, the yes-no tester framework. I really encourage you to play with that. It takes some time, but as you do it, like I found that like after I played with it, and then it was so powerful. It's one of my favorites for sure. Another attainment strategy is let's redraw something from a different perspective, right? So that helps build conceptual understanding. So in this case, if we're looking at sustainability, but here's a little invitation for thinking where we're doing it in a creative way. You're taking an existing ad for bottled water, you're redrawing from a different perspective. If we're looking at this concept of sustainability, we're now exploring some different dimensions of that concept, looking at it just from our everyday life, and hey, if we're going to put a sustainability lens, what would this look like? What would this ad look like? And another really powerful strategy is the concept map. There's mind maps and there's concept maps. Concept maps really do show connections between ideas. So this is an example from a grade 8 geography class where a student did a concept map around urban sustainability and really developed some deep conceptual understandings, putting different lenses on the term. And again, in the book Beyond Monet, there's a whole chapter on concept maps, and then they actually did another book, I think it was Barry Bennett, on graphic intelligence that just explores different ways of mapping and building conceptual understanding. So that instead of a final exam, why not do a concept map? Or some suggest using the concept map as a precursor to an exam, because if you're really going to test on the exam, looking at relationships between ideas, the concept map really prepares the students for doing that. And when we're assessing this thinking, we're looking at, can students draw on accurate and relevant information? Can they make reasoned judgments? Using the criteria, can they use key concepts? Are they using strategies? Do they exhibit those dispositions? So we start to use the intellectual tools as our assessment lens as well. And that can be really, really useful because we can provide some specific guidance then to focus specifically on their thinking. So we're just coming to the end, so I did want to invite you, to complete your 3-2-1, and just also ask you to think about this strategy that I used, where, an exit card is a common task, but instead of giving it to you at the end, I had you thinking about it all the way through. And what, if you notice anything, what has been the impact, if any, of my decision to do that? Has that affected your thinking, or what the exit card will look like in any way, because I gave you the challenge up front rather than at the end of the session? And just as we're closing up, some of you might be part of school boards who are partners of the consortium. You can go onto our website at tc2.ca and see if you're a partner. And if you are, when you register for an account, just use your work email and you can get in. If your board isn't a partner, you can get an individual membership for $40 a year, and it does provide you with a lot of different free resources, including over 80 tools for thought lessons that do, a number of them have some rich concept attainment strategies built into them. And definitely they're all focused on nurturing critical thinking. We have those inquiry packs. I showed you some slides. Those are available for purchase. We did a series of inquiry packs in social studies, in history and geography. So you can take a look. The first lesson and the launch are free, so even there you can get some ideas if you want to scaffold in your own classroom. But those are there on our website. And also there's critical challenge lessons, so you can actually search according to grade level and subject area and see what lessons. We do have some subjects and grade levels more than others, just because of, as a not-for-profit, sometimes, we're funded to develop in certain areas, and we'd like to continue developing in all areas. And of course, we also have source documents, picture sets, historical thinking. We have 6 videos on the 6 historical thinking frames that you can use in class, which is really great. So I did just want to share a little bit about that. Feel free to email me. Here's my email address if you want to write that down. You can tweet as well. If you follow me on Twitter, I'd love to follow you back. And I do share a lot of different resources and articles connected to the things that I'm really passionate about, including thinking and global citizenship, and equity in art and food. But I definitely have a lot on my site around nurturing thinking in students. So please feel free to follow me on Twitter. I'd love to get your 3-2-1 sent to my email. I hope that this has been a worthwhile session for you, and thank you for spending your Thursday night with me.
Okay, that was perfect timing. Here it is, exactly 9 o'clock. Folks, you can feel free to put your comments into the chat or any final questions that you have for Maria. Thank you so much. Maria, you always provide such a well-researched and thoughtful and mindful reflection on critical thinking and its role in the classroom. I taught in gifted education for a number of years, and we had no curriculum. Isn't that amazing? We actually designed our own, which was all about critical and creative thinking. And when I see so many of your examples and the type of thinking and conceptual understandings that you're encouraging, it's just what we did, and it was such a joy working in that. But my students always said to me, why can't all of our classes be like this? It doesn't need to just be in gifted programs. Anyway, thank you so much. Lots of food for thought. I'm going to stop the recording, and then I'm going to share with you a couple of OTF things, and then turn it back to Maria in case there's any final questions or thoughts. So once again, thank you everyone for attending and for your input tonight, for talking and writing, and thanks so much, Maria, for a great session.